When excavation workers in Nevada opened a rock outside the village of Tonopah, they discovered an underground cave containing a big secret that struggled. The prospectors tried to decipher the mystery, but in the end, they discovered something amazing. Joe pointed toward a barren outcrop outside Tonopah, Nevada, a place even scorpions fear. The teeth of the excavator broke through the stubborn rock with a loud noise, and the team expected to see the pale gray color of the ore or the shine of a silver vein. But instead, they were staring into a void. It was a black emptiness that defied the harsh desert landscape. Joe and Sarah exchanged a look. They had dug into an underground cave. The lights cut through the darkness as they were carefully lowered into the temporary setup. Joe went down first, his descent slow and deliberate. The beam of his flashlight revealed a small chamber, a space that shouldn't exist inside solid rock. Sarah followed him, her geologist's mind wrestling with the impossible. The cavity was roughly hewn, its surface showing signs of tool work, but there were no signs of mine supports or storage. It seemed to have been built for a specific purpose, but for what purpose? And more importantly, who built it? Centuries had passed. Since anyone had set foot in this hidden place, there had been nothing but darkness, except for the far corner, where there was a box that seemed untouched by time. The wood was dark, cracked and warped by age, bound with faded iron bands. This was more than just neglected supplies or the stock of a forgotten mine. Joe moved toward it with some effort, trying to steady his trembling hands. He fumbled with the rusty lock, which gave way with an unnaturally loud sound, echoing through the silent room like a gunshot. The lid opened, and inside he found a leather-bound journal, resting atop a neatly stacked bundle of brittle old papers. Faded writing covered the yellowed pages. A date going back more than 2 centuries stared at them, along with a handwritten name on the cover that seemed strangely familiar. But Joe's mind struggled to place it through the haze of adrenaline and doubt. Sarah let out a soft breath beside him, recognition beginning to dawn in her eyes. They exchanged another look, and a silent question passed between them. Could this be real, or was it an elaborate trick? Was this a planted artifact meant to deceive those who dared to dream of lost riches in a land exhausted with a reverence bordering on the sacred? Joe gently opened the journal. Each page was a fragile window into the past. The ink was faded, and the handwriting was elegant yet strange. He traced the letters with his rough fingers. Sarah was already immersed in the text. The language, expressions, and descriptions fascinated her. She was certain it was from the early 19th century, as the date indicated. If this was a forgery, an enormous effort had gone into it. She turned to another page. She noted the mention of a particular landmark, a bend in the river, which was confirmed on a dusty map she was carrying. Every match she made with documented historical records was a small victory. In the end, she gave up her composure. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a rough sketch of a mountain range. "This matches the old maps of the area, but look here, this hill is no longer there. The land must have shifted over time." Then she pronounced her judgment aloud, pointing to a faded name on the inside cover of the notebook, and said, "Lewis and Clark. This belonged to the Lewis and Clark expedition." Joe grumbled. Sarah was right. This detail indicated a level of authenticity that was hard to ignore. The evidence was piling up piece by piece, carefully. The names, the locations, and the descriptions of weather events all formed a chain of authenticity stretching across the gap of time. Joe and Sarah knew they couldn't keep something like this a secret. There were too many questions, and too many eyes in this mining town that was once sleepy, but would soon awaken with the momentum of discovery. One wrong word or one careless slip, and they would be surrounded by journalists. Then the fortune seekers would come, and those looking for a piece of history that wasn't theirs. Joe knew the right person to contact. Evelyn Baker was a local history professor, eager to protect Nevada's heritage, and most importantly, sharp as a sword and had an eye that never missed a detail. Most people saw her as an eccentric old woman, obsessed with old diaries and dusty records, but Joe noticed the spark in her eye. He said she had the hunger of a seeker of knowledge rather than gold. It took longer than expected to reach Evelyn. The university receptionist spoke of conferences and field research outside the office, but Joe was persistent. Finally, his urgent need overcame the layers of academia. His call with Evelyn was brief and direct. Bring it and tell no one. The road to her secluded house in the foothills surrounding Tunis Lanuba took a long time. Sarah kept reviewing the details in her mind. The dates, the cross-references, anything that could be used to prove the authenticity of the impossible notebook. Evelyn greeted them with a piercing look. Joe carefully placed the box on the floor and the notebook on the overloaded table. In her study, Evelyn moved forward with unusual calm, put on thin cotton gloves, and gently lifted the ancient book. The hours that followed were a whirlwind of meticulous examination, interspersed with periods of strange silence. Evelyn would sometimes whisper to herself, occasionally fire sharp questions at Sarah, and often she would simply stare at the pages. Joe and Sarah waited anxiously for Evelyn to finally break her silence. Then, at last, she looked at them, her eyes widening slowly. She placed the journal back on the table. "Well," she said, "it seems you found something unusual." A wave of relief washed over them, but the celebration was quickly cut short. Evelyn picked up the leather-bound journal and turned it over in her hands. Sarah gasped and put her hand over her mouth, while Joe let out an astonished cry at what couldn't be hidden in the bottom of the false box. It was a collection of neatly folded maps. Unlike the journal, these papers were not yellowed by time. The paper was pristine, and the ink was still a deep black. The maps looked newer, but the unmistakable hand of someone long dead was clear in the lines. There were precise notes about landmarks. The maps were both familiar and completely strange at the same time. "These," Evelyn breathed, "aren't recorded anywhere, not in any known record of the Lewis and Clark expedition." The maps spread out across Evelyn's cluttered desk. It was a mystery within a mystery, a whisper from the depths of time, holding no meaning in the present. Joe traced the familiar outlines of the surrounding Nevada mountains, but he found anomalies and oddities, where there should have been sharp peaks and rivers flowing in directions that defied nature itself. What did this mean? He asked, but no one was prepared to answer. Sarah was carefully comparing the maps with the historical geological surveys of the area. She said, "There have been minor changes over the centuries, of course fault lines and erosion, but nothing of this magnitude could have happened. There was nothing that could explain the differences between modern geology and the historical maps." Joe moved closer, studying the fine lines and confident strokes that marked the roads and features. They were made by the steady hand of a skilled cartographer. Before he could say anything, Evelyn nodded slowly. "Yes," she told him. "This undoubtedly belonged to Lewis." Sarah was the first to ask why the map might include roads and places that didn't exist. Simply, always pragmatic, Evelyn set aside the puzzle of the distorted terrain and told them to think about what the maps didn't show. There was no mention of the mining camps that would only be established decades later, nor any trace of Tonopah itself. If Louis had discovered a hint of silver here, every map would have reflected that. A chill swept through the room. The history of the West was built on men driven mad by silver fever, and here they were sitting on a secret that could have rewritten all of that. If Louis chose not to reveal it, there must have been a reason. Silence fell. As each of them struggled with the consequences, Joe suggested that Louis might have found something else. Perhaps something more valuable than silver. Sarah asked, "What could be more valuable than silver?" He pointed to a series of random marks on the edge of one of the maps. They were geometric shapes, a set of unfamiliar symbols, standing out against the detailed depiction of the landscape. "A code," Sarah whispered, her eyes shining with excitement at the prospect of facing a puzzle worthy of her intelligence. Evelyn gave a half smile. "It seems that Captain Lewis was a man of hidden depths. This isn't just cartography, it's encryption. This discovery wasn't just a trace from the past. It was a map to unknown possibilities. This was a code that could lead them to a hidden truth, and they wouldn't rest until they cracked it." In the end, Evelyn had to announce it to the public. This was too big to keep a secret, and it wasn't ethical to keep the Academy out of the loop. Her announcement that the diary and the maps had been found, and that they were undoubtedly authentic, sent shockwaves through the quiet academic world. The news spread like wildfire in the desert, and soon Nuba became a name on everyone's lips. The ancient city was used to a slow and steady pulse, but now it was driven into a violent storm. The dusty streets were crowded with news vans, their satellite dishes raised toward the sky like strange flowers. Journalists jostled for a spot, and both accredited and self-proclaimed historians descended on the site. Everyone was armed with a theory or speculation. The miners blinked in the glare of the camera flashes. Joe was uncomfortable, even at the best of times, with all this attention. Sarah found comfort and a kind of solace in facts, clinging to the tangible certainty of geology and historical records to drown out the media noise. But even she felt the first whispers of anxiety as the crowd grew and intentions became less clear. Then the men in suits arrived. There were representatives from museums, historical societies, and wealthy collectors. Each one wore a carefully crafted smile and carried meticulously prepared offers. Negotiations continued privately, away from the family. There was talk about preservation and the importance of making the discovery accessible to the public. But behind all that, there was an undeniable undercurrent: ownership. Who will benefit from the knowledge, the dollars, or the fame? The initial euphoria of discovery turned into a complicated knot of exhaustion. The maps, the code, and the possible secrets they held now felt heavier than any silver he might find. Joe and Sarah felt that their bond had been put under relentless pressure, and a looming question remained. Who could they trust? Wouldn't they end up being overwhelmed by crowds of the media? Finding someone qualified and trustworthy to decipher the maps became a delicate matter. Evelyn discreetly contacted the famous cryptography expert, Dr. Eleanor Pierce. The woman was known for her intelligence and ironclad discretion, and she understood the importance of what was at stake. Dr. Pierce arrived with a calmness that cut through the chaos at the excavation site. She looked over the maps, took note of the familiar outlines and the mysterious symbols of the code, then began her methodical work. Historical ciphers were her specialty, a blend of linguistics, mathematics, and the art of understanding how a cunning mind from the past could conceal its intentions. The days turned into a haze of tense waiting. Joe and Sarah held their breath as Dr. Pierce worked. It was a silent battle between intellect and the unyielding secrets of the past. They were miners used to finding answers in the earth, but this was more elusive, as if history itself was at stake. Then it happened. Dr. Pierce called them into her temporary tent and pointed to a translation written in the margin. The words were simple, shocking, and completely confusing. The maps didn't lead to gold, or lost treasure caches, or even forgotten pioneer trails. They were charting something less material, but infinitely more valuable: water. This was a detailed map of underground water networks and hidden springs in the dry Nevada desert. A cry escaped from Sarah that was, at its core, geological. She understood the magnitude of it all. Louis had discovered a truth that had eluded everyone who came after him. This dry land was secretly rich, its pulse connected to a hidden life force beneath the rocks and sand. It took time for the implications to sink in. These maps held the power to reshape the region. Drought, the relentless threat of the desert, could be alleviated. The possibilities of agriculture could be unlocked. New horizons could open for those who dare to dream of green fields where only grass now grows. Now, Joe and Sarah looked at each other. It wasn't about personal wealth, fleeting fame, or their place in the history books. They had inadvertently been entrusted with a legacy that carried the weight of the future. The world soon descended upon Tonopah with renewed excitement. This time, it wasn't driven by the thirst for gold, but rather, the allure of water beneath the desert was the magnet. Joe and Sarah, the seasoned worker and the practical geologist, would be remembered not for what they took from the earth, but for what they released back into the world. Isn't that remarkable? How can something historical have such a big impact on the present? Do you have a story about something historical that was found and what happened to it? Did it have a big impact on someone's life? Tell us about it in the comments. We'd love to hear your story, but for now we're leaving. We'll see you in the next video.